Welcome back, everybody, and this is our last section on the High Renaissance in Italy. The artists we're looking at in this section are collectively known as the Mannerists. Their style in Italian is called the Maniera, or Mannerism, and not really a compliment. It's a term that was applied after the fact. It has a negative connotation. It implies that their work is mannered. That's not really a term that we use in common 21st century speech anymore. To say that someone is behaving, we might say that they're being pretentious or putting on airs, or they're kind of acting a little bit in an exaggerated way. So the artists of the Maniera exaggerate what they're doing by really stretching the human body out, by changing the proportions pretty significantly. And truly, the reason I put these kind of silly stretched versions of Michelangelo on the screen is because they are absolutely inspired by Michelangelo's distortions of the human form. Now, some of his distortions we talked about with the David, for instance, were because he was going to be seen from below, and so therefore to make him look like the right proportions from the ground, the head is much larger than it should be for the rest of the body. But the in scale between the Christ figure and the Mary figure and the Pietà are really getting closer to what Mannerism is all about. We also saw a lot of kind of over-exaggerated musculature in the work that Michelangelo did as a painter. So these are all artists who are high Renaissance. They are in the latter phase of the Renaissance. It's not as if Mannerism is a separate time period, but we can kind of group them together idea that they were exploring. Now, the Mannerist style is going to be primarily in the same regions that we've seen up until this point, centered around Florence, Venice, Siena, and of course in Rome as well. One of the first artists that we'll meet in the Mannerist style is Pontormo. Pontormo's piece to know for the test you see here in its position in the church. This is the deposition altarpiece for the Capponi family chapel in Santa Felicita in Florence, and there's the painting itself. So it really shows you off the bat what Mannerism is all about. You can see colors that are nice and bright and pastel, kind of like what we saw with Michelangelo's own paintings, and clearly the figure of Christ looks a lot like the way that the body is handled in Michelangelo's Pietà. What you're seeing, though, if you really start breaking it down, is kind of an exact of the form. The bodies are stretched a little bit to make them just a little bit more elegant, to make them flow in referred to quite frequently as the S curve. If you look throughout the composition, your eye does kind of tend to flow from these figures at the top into the arms of these figures, through the body of Christ, and down again, kind of in a big, elegant S curve. And that curve is counteracted around the figure of Mary, going slightly the opposite direction, almost the shape of a question mark. So the idea of your eye moving or traveling through the composition is pretty central to what Mannerism is all about. Notice also that the figures themselves tend to have kind of exaggerated colors, that this upper garment may well be a clinging fabric, but it also kind of reads as a skin tone here in the figure holding Christ. Other figure, though, holding him up is really, I think, the most important one for us to look at. If you look at where the head and shoulders of the figure carrying Christ are, you can see how elongated his torso has to become in order to place the hips and legs where they are here. We also suspect that this section of the painting, the saint in the background here, is actually a portrait of the author of the painting himself. This is actually a picture of Pontormo. Impressive. Pontormo's work very often has this intense kind of color and bright color that we associate with Michelangelo. We sometimes can see the difference between the style of the High Renaissance and later styles, because you don't notice a lot of reflection of one color that you might see, say, in the Impressionist movement in the 1800s. The colors do tend to stay within the object that they are depicting. So the Mary's robe stays inside that robe and doesn't seem to affect the other colors around it. This is his visitation. It's a visit of Mary to her cousin who was pregnant with John the Baptist. So John and Christ are relatives. Rosso Fiorentino, the red-headed Florentine, next Mannerist artist that we'll study, and you notice his movement is pretty dramatic. The figures seem in this piece to almost be falling out of the frame, and if you really look at his Descent from the Cross on the left, you can see that the figures are painted in pretty sharp-edged, almost geometric suggests some of the abstraction that we'll see in the later 20th century, in particular the way the shape of the jaw into the beard in this figure, that the fabric is painted in sort of facets, almost like a carving in this piece as well. It's pretty remarkable. I wanted to get to Correggio's most important works. There are lots of examples in the lecture that are beyond what I'm going to cover in the summary, so there's plenty of things for you to look at in a little bit depth as we go through the summer here, or through the semester. I wanted you to definitely be aware of this pair of pieces by the painter Correggio. This is Jupiter and the one to recognize for the test, and it makes a pair with Jupiter and Ganymede on the right. Now, we know from studying the character of Zeus or Jupiter, the king of the gods, quite frequently had relationships, romances with human beings and human beings of both genders. So what you're seeing here are two of Jupiter's lovers and him presenting himself to them, or even engaging with them or abducting them in a disguise. So often to thwart his wife or to keep his affair, would assume a different personality or a different appearance. So he appears to Io as a mist or a fog. You can really see his face. If you look really closely, you can see a kind of humanoid face there coming close to her own. And he appears to Ganymede, whom he abducts, to be the cupbearer. He fills the wine glasses for everybody. This is Jupiter in the guise of an eagle. There's the face. If you see it up close, it's pretty awesome. Another artist I thought you guys would really like would be Parmigiano. Parmigiano is a Mannerist painter who also is really well aware of optical effects. This painting is actually flat, but what he's doing is trying to paint the effect of a convex mirror. So concave would be like a cavity. It would move away from us on a curve. A convex mirror would bow outward toward us. A concave mirror would look a little bit like the kind of fisheye effect that you get when you're looking through a peephole in a doorway. So this is a self-portrait, pretty piece. And you can also see how much, not just the distortion of the fisheye effect of the convex mirror, but if you really look at those fingers, they almost look like they've been elongated to almost an alien proportion as opposed to human fingers. You'll notice in Parmigiano's works, a lot of times the fingers really exaggerated. Parmigiano is also one of the first Italian artists to make his own fine art prints. He worked in etching, engraving, and dry point. So he's one of the first artists to employ printmaking processes for making his own work, as opposed to just using it as a way of reproducing work or hiring a printmaker or licensing a printmaker to make copies. Parmigiano's piece to know for the test is the one to the right of the long neck. Her proportions are clearly exaggerated. If you look at the neck itself, that obviously is the first thing that comes to mind. You can see how many extra vertebrae she must have to have a neck this long. But she has the kind of characteristic elongated fingers. Her torso is pretty long as well. And you also notice that in a funny way, she's holding the Christ child in an almost casual kind of pose. He looks as if he is slightly. But again, that's not meant to be disrespectful. The idea here is to really accentuate this curve from her neck to her arm, through the Christ child's body, to the leg of the saint, that brings us down to the side here. You also notice another example here, this figure to the side, if you look from the waist up, seems logically proportioned. Look how enormously long that leg is, especially from hip to knee, and clearly exaggerated. There is a prophet in the background of the painting. No one knows for sure exactly who he is or what he's doing, which kind of adds to the mystery of the piece, as does this bizarre piece of architecture. There's this column that goes to nowhere. It doesn't really seem to attach to anything, that seems to just be kind of floating in space. You can see the Mannerists are getting more and more dramatic. Their paintings are spilling off of the walls and starting to create this feeling of intense movement and exaggeration, and that's very much what Mannerism is all about. So the kind of backhanded compliment of the title of their style implies that it's just a little too much. It's a little over the top. I wanted us to be aware of Jacopo Robusti, known as Tintoretto. This is a great example of kind of breaking the fourth. In this case, St. Mark is appearing to perform a miracle. This is a Christian slave who cannot be punished. They keep trying to break his bones, and each time the punishment is thwarted. Each time, because the slave prayed to St. Mark appears to him and breaks the tools of the torture. And you can see the torturer is holding the broken remnants of the torture in and kind of showing them to the crowd there. We know that Tintoretto did some amazing work in the use of lighting effects. He often wax replicas or figurines to paint from, and so he would sometimes create small dioramas and light them so that he could create these really dramatic lighting effects. You notice his take on the Last Supper creates a completely unusual composition. Instead of facing head on to the front of the tabletop, we're no longer in that position. We're seeing everything from the side. It's really a pretty remarkable painting. Definitely interesting Mannerist artist to be aware of. His work quite often is religious only, almost as an afterthought. His paintings look more like settings of parties or elegant gatherings in contemporary society, and you see a lot of figures dressed in contemporary clothing. One of the things that is really remarkable about the work is that he's working primarily in Venice, and in Venice there were quite a lot of trade. There was quite a lot of intermixing of people from different countries and different cultures, and so in some of his work you'll begin to see people who are very obviously different from a lot of the other figures in the compositions we've seen so far. See people of color for the first time. You can see a young boy here as well. There are figures here that are also in turn. You can see that Venice kind of acted as a crossroads of the world and kind of a multicultural center. So in an interesting way, I think that really Veronese making paintings about the culture he was in, that's what he was interested in more, I think, than painting religious themes. So for this commission, you see that he is a Last Supper, but really it's an excuse for him to paint the culture of the city of Venice and kind of hide the Last Supper inside that. In fact, he was called before the Inquisition in 1573 because of the irreverence of his work, and he defended himself in a kind of interesting way. And he was successful in this argument. He argued to the inquisitors that he and other artists deserved the same kind of leeway that we would give to people who were known to be insane, the same kind of license that was accorded to madmen and sinners. Kind of interesting to think about. Fascinating to see the culture of Venice come to life in what is otherwise might walk past and think doesn't have as much resonance, but clearly is important for us to recognize that this is a culture that was much more dynamic and much less homogeneous than we might imagine it to be. Veronese's Marriage at Cana, similar situation in which we have this really dramatic party going on. There's Renaissance instruments being played in the front, and then there's sort of the miracle of changing the in this smallest part of the image. I really like the dogs and the musical instruments in this one myself. We also want to call attention to the artist Bruncino. Bruncino is the adopted son of Pontormo, court painter in his own. He did definitely make money selling portraits, working as a portrait painter. And you can see in the clothing style of his clients how wealthy and how much power the clients really had. You can see the detachable sleeves are still persistent into the 1500s, but there's even slashing, that's the cuts through the fabric to allow the undergarment to be pulled through in between those laced together pieces. You can really get a sense of the finery of the jewelry and the brocade, all of the needlework that's going into creating these outfits. But you see that there's still some exaggeration, of course, even within the portraits, especially when it comes to the hands. Now, Bruncino's work is definitely highly detailed. The more there is to see, which I think is one of the things that people really enjoy about seeing his work. There are plenty of subjects that he deals with, though, that go even further into exploration of mythological subjects than almost any of the other artists that we've seen up to this point. You can see that the figures are in pretty difficult contorted positions and poses, which brings us to arguably his most famous, almost infamous painting. This is most likely created for Cosimo de' Medici to give as a gift to the King of France. Now, the French court is far more open to seeing nudity in portraiture, and in fact, the French court is kind of known for the sensuality of the paint that they favored, and we'll look at that when we turn to the Renaissance outside of Italy. So it's possible that this was an appeal directly to the taste of the court. But you can also sense that there's a little bit of an uncomfortable, almost a feeling that the image is inappropriate as you're looking at it. The subject is Venus, Cupid, Folly, and Time. Those are the four prominent figures. There are other figures in there, but the that disturbs us the most, I'm sure, is that kind of embrace and kiss going on between Cupid and Venus. Well, that makes sense. They're aspects of love, but Cupid is actually Venus's son, which starts to make this a very disturbing image on one level. Remember, of course, that the character of Venus, the idea of her, is that she is the goddess of love, but her son by the god of war is Cupid. Now, the god of war and the goddess of love are absolute, and their son kind of embodies both of their natures to some extent. Cupid, we know, has the power to cause people to fall instantly in love, and we're all familiar with that. You get struck by Cupid's arrow and you fall head over heels for the next person you see. The thing that we often forget is that Cupid actually has two types of arrows. The golden arrow makes you fall in love. The bronze arrow makes you fall instantly into hate. So if you think about it, Cupid has that ability to cause that intense, immediate response that you sometimes have to people. I'm sure at some point you've met someone who's done absolutely nothing directly to you at first meeting. That's also Cupid's power. So Cupid is not one for rational thought. Cupid is all about impulse. He wants people to act on those impulses. So that's part of the theme here. The figure in the background that seems delighted by the whole thing and is about to flower petals everywhere is clearly Folly. Folly is beyond reason. Folly is only about enjoyment and silliness, and Folly for the moral implications of what's going on. This figure is usually associated with Envy, this greenish toned skinned figure in the background. Clearly not pretty enough to get a kiss of their own. The figure directly behind Folly, I think, is the most interesting one. It seems to be figure, arms and head, but it doesn't end in a normal human torso and legs. What we see looks like some kind of figure, perhaps a lion, but it also seems to have a dragon-like or snake-like tail that it ends with. And if you really look at the thumbs on this hand and on that one, there is that pinkish fabric on this shoulder, so clearly that is meant to be the shoulder this way, the hands are on the wrong side, as if that entire body is twisted, and the weird way the neck is masked really make by the body the head feel very separated from everything else. This I really think is meant to be a deceiving kind of figure, and it's clearly associated with comedy tragedy masks just below it. And of course, anything resembling a snake this close to a nude woman with an apple is going to trigger religious ideas of the devil, the idea of temptation. So this whole figure acts as a trickster character. It's also kind of intriguing to think we have figures who seem to be responding to things, sort of an angelic figure on one side, but clearly an older figure with this hourglass on the back is Father Time. And the gesture that he's making, some people have analyzed this as if he is pulling the curtain back and exposing this inappropriate sin, but it looks to me like, based on the way the hand is positioned and the fact that we're seeing the top of the forearm there, it's as though grabbing this fabric and trying to pull it down and cover up all of that sin. So we definitely have the idea of narrative that can be read in a lot of different directions. It ultimately is meant to allow us to draw our own conclusions, but the more that we look at the way the main figures are painted, Cupid and Venus in particular, she's not in a comfortable seated position. She's almost kneeling to show as much of the torso from this angle as we're seeing. And look at the contortion in the back of the Cupid figure. There's almost no way you could get your body twisted into this position and neck in this area to be able to enact this pose yourself. So again, the bodies have been really distorted, elongated, and a bit twisted. You notice how much seat is happening here in the Mannerist style as well. There are Mannerist sculptors as well as painters, and you can spend some time looking at Mannerist sculpture if you have the time as well, including the work of Leonardo da Vinci's nephew. Brings us then to architecture. I do want to take a minute to look at Palladio. Palladio is the author of the 4 books of architecture. He really spent his career documenting, recording, and making diagrams and elevations and plans of all of the antique buildings he could find, all of the buildings from the classical era that were still available to be studied, and he collected these. They were published after his death, and they very much the kind of guide for architects going forward. One of the comments that he makes in his book, which I think is really kind of fascinating, is the blessed Creator has ordered the members of our bodies in such a manner that the most beautiful are in places most exposed to view and the less comely are more hidden. So he's saying that the building itself should present the most beautiful aspects to you, the functional aspects might be hidden. So the face of the building, what we call, should be a point of emphasis. You can see that he's really interested in the proportions, kind of like what we discussed with Leonardo, and you can see that he is recording the placement of niches, columns, where the sculptures are, all of this in really exquisite detail. It's going to help guide architects of the Renaissance, but then even more so, it's kind of interesting to think about the fact that his works, once published, are then going to be the world. And when people came to what is now the United States of America, they brought the books with them as guides to help in building architecture on this continent. And so there are some connections between Palladio's designs, which doesn't this look like it comes from Rome, but that was a contemporary design by Palladio. That piece was built in 1570, completed 1570. The design of this building similar to the layout of plantation houses in the American South. Maybe not with the dome on top, certainly at the beginning, but porches with pediments like this, and a simple cross floor plan where you go up a main staircase along a central hallway, 4 main rooms on either side. that central hall is exactly the base floor plan for plantation houses like Drayton Hall in Charleston, South Carolina. I just wanted you to be a chance to see these two because they're just really fun. They're not in the textbook, and that's part of the awesome aspect of being able to take an art history class, just what's in the book, and be able to see the context of the arts in a broader way. This is the work of the painter Archibald, and he made these amazing kind of surrealist images of portraits made out of animals or plants. Obviously, the sun on the right is mammals primarily. The one on the right on the screen is pretty amazing to me. That one is made entirely of fire. You can see that he's themed them around plants, in this case, that are available at different times of year. The winter one is pretty incredible. These are also pretty awesome. This one is the same painting. It's reversible, so if you were to hang it this way, it looks essentially basket of fruit, like a simple still life, but if you turn it the other way around, it's a face that's winking at you. Same thing kind of happens here and here.